Hey, everybody, welcome to the Independent Ink with Mr. Fish. I'm Mr. Fish. What follows is a conversation I recently had with Roger Hallam, who is considered the preeminent environmental activist of the 21st century. He's a co founder of Extinction Rebellion and also Just Stop Oil. He's also the author of a new book, which I highly recommend, called Suicide. Very, very practical guide to giving a shit and doing something about it. He has a new project starting this Saturday on the 7th called 4 Billion Dead. I will be including links so you can check that out and get involved. So here's my conversation with my pal, Roger Hallam. So I really appreciate you taking the time to talk. I know that you're very, very busy with very good reason. I mean, a lot of your work has to do with the timeliness of shitgivery and, making sure that we get to the point of self-preservation as a species as soon as possible. So without
Yeah.
further ado, let's just start with a general question. I know that you recently spent some time in prison. So let's just take a second to talk about the circumstances that landed you there.
Yeah, great. Well, yeah, and also, yeah, thanks very much for having me on and everything. And yeah, I was in a court case. Where are we? July 2024, and there was there was a series of actions about 2 years before that, I think, which involved people getting onto the bridges over the motorways to make the point that we need to slash carbon emissions in the UK. There was a big sort of action, about 100 people stopping traffic by getting onto these bridges. Um, for the record, I wasn't involved. But I was sort of trolleyed in, as I tend to do a speech to rally people to the urgency of the situation.
And to be
And
clear, too, I mean, you're a known entity for this kind of activity. Right. I mean, so this is you're somebody who one would want to invite, you know, to an action like this. And unfortunately, it also
yeah,
puts you in crosshairs for people who are going to do everything they can to shut down, these kinds of voices and this kind of activity.
yeah. Well, what happened? Yeah, I mean, this is my bread and butter sort of activity, and for decades, as it were, this was pretty normal in civil disobedience actions, in the UK and across the Western world. You invite someone to say, yeah, it's a good idea, this is what the situation demands, etc., etc. But as you know, and presumably your listeners sort of are aware, that over the Western world, and particularly in the UK, there's been draconian laws, as they're called. And what happened was a Sun journalist was there. It's a sort of right-wing tabloid, and she did a sort of deal with the police, as you might say. And the police, she recorded it, gave it to the police. The police came round to arrest me. She was going to have me filmed being arrested. I was actually out. But the upshot of it was I thought it was no big deal because I've done lots of these talks. I thought I'd be out the following morning. I mean, lots of police raids happen for activists in the UK, but I was on remand. They put me in prison for 4 months before they finally let me out on a tag. And then a year and a half later, there was this big court case, and they gave us 4 to 5 years for conspiracy to cause a public nuisance, which is the quaint English phrase for, what maybe the bad guys are doing is causing a public nuisance, of course. But
Right.
the so that was the longest prison sentence given for peaceful civil disobedience, since whenever the
Right.
Napoleonic Wars or whatever.
Right.
Even the suffragettes would get 3 years, 2 years. Like, once it gets past five, it usually means you've killed someone or something. But I hasten to add, I haven't done anything other than do a 20-minute Zoom call. So it's really a sign of the times, and it went to appeal. I got out on license last August. So that's the story on that one.
Well, which brings up a lot of really interesting points. I mean, as you said, causing some sort of public disturbance, and like, so what what does that really mean? I mean, because there's the economic component of that, but there's also the piece that is demanding certain normalities to be altered, and how society functions and how economies and governments function, right? Because I remember reading about your case and seeing how vaguely drawn, like the criminality that they were trying to tag you with, was
Mm,
very interesting to me, because you see it in other historically in other actions of dissent, just with the civil rights era here, for example. It was considered disruptive for Black people to go sit at lunch counters where white people eat. That
yeah.
could ruin the business because white patrons would refuse to go in. The same thing with the Little Rock Nine and the desegregation of schools.
Mm,
You have Black students all of a sudden going into this institution of learning, and then they use the justification by saying now it's a deterrent to actually education for the other students that are there. Um,
mm.
so that's what I found really interesting about it. The fact that people can make that argument and have it so vaguely drawn, and then have you end up behind bars as some sort of indication that now we have a solution to this. And
Mm.
so what does this signal? I mean, it seems obvious, but I'd like to hear you talk about it in your own words. What does this signal to a society that the imperative for more and more quote unquote common citizens to get involved with this kind of thinking, let alone action? What is the message that is being very deliberately sent out to the public?
Well, the simple answer to that is the state has a Hobbesian logic, as you might say, which, Thomas Hobbes is the political philosopher of the secular state. And the logic is that the state is supreme and the state is there to prevent disruption and disorder. And it's justified to engage in whatever's necessary in order to prevent that, because if the state collapses, you have anarchy and, the law of all against all, right? That's the logic of the establishment for the last, 300-400 years in Western societies. And this was framed, of course, as yet another example of unjustified disruption because of this logic of the state. So that's the perspective of the bad guys, as you might say. But
Yeah.
if I could say something here, just to sort of break the narrative a bit, what we were doing was actually compatible with the Hobbesian logic. And I've written about this just to plug my book called Suicide. Um, what I argue, yeah, there we go. What I argued, it wasn't really an argument because it's just objective in the sense that there's a well-known exception, as it's called in political philosophy, to the Hobbesian logic, and that is when the people running the state are engaging activities that destroy the state. You see what I mean? It's like, you might disagree, but it's got its own logic, right? If you agree with the premise, the state's got to be maintained, then there is, you just got to do in anyone that challenges the state. But with this one exception, when the agents of the state, the people that control the state, are objectively destroying the state. So usually, historically, this means, spying for the Russians or, treasonous activities, getting the Catholics in 18th century England. It's like that, the Catholics are running the state. We've got to overthrow the state, this sort of thing.
Right.
Now, we haven't had an objective situation of where those that are running the state are destroying the state since that Catholic example in 300, 400 years ago. But the fact of the matter is, the people that are running the state are now destroying the state. And this is not an abstraction. I mean, we can concretize it by saying there's a substantive probability that AMOC is going to destroy the British Isles in the next, 50 years, i.e., the changing of the currents. Like this is a meteorite coming to the Earth, right? It's not something you have an opinion on. It's a substantive, non-trivial possibility and arguably an inevitability. So the Hobbesian argument basically collapses in on of itself. So the more of a Hobbesian you are, the more you should actually support rebellion against the state. And of course, rebels in history have used this argument over and over again. It hasn't been like, and this is why, wonderful, of course, as the example of the civil rights movement in America is. That's not the analogy here. The analogy is the destruction of the state by the agents of the state, right? We're not appealing to a special interest, valid as that special interest is, whether that's, women or black people or gay people. That's not what we're dealing with in the 2020s. What we're dealing with is a project that destroys the actual social body itself. And this is what makes the crime of putting carbon into the atmosphere the absolute crime. It's not a relative crime, it's an absolute crime in that Hobbesian sense because you're destroying the state. So you see what I'm getting at here. And of
Yeah.
course, like a lot of the liberals on both sides of the fence conspire to avoid this issue, right? So the lawyers were going, "Oh, Roger, you should be, going to the judge and going, oh, it's our conscience. We don't like the idea of carbon emissions, this sort of Quaker Thoreau routine, right?" And
Mhm.
I was going, it's nothing to do with conscience, nothing to do with Thoreau. It's not like the state's doing a bad thing. The people running the state are destroying the state. And
Right.
that's how for me, that's how you explode the argument of the opposition. Um, but no one would do that. The lawyers wouldn't do it. They wouldn't say we had right of necessity, i.e., what we were trying to prevent was massive and Durham upon. And the reason why is because they knew it wouldn't work. Right? So
Yeah.
this is why we were called the Whole Truth Five, because I said to the judge, actually, I want to explain why, to the jury, why basically you're involved in a treasonous act. Because if you put people in prison that are trying to save the state from the agents of the state, you're a traitor, technically speaking, right? In the classical definition.
Right.
And of course, he would have nothing of it. And obviously, the lawyers are right in a sort of, pragmatic sense. But I'm not interested in the pragmatism. I'm interested in the truth, which is why we were called the Whole Truth Five. And obviously, people may know that for the first time ever, really, in the British court, or at least for a generation or two, we refuse to shut up. Because
Right.
if
Right.
you take an oath from God as to tell the whole truth, then obviously you're spiritually and morally obliged to tell the whole truth, which is what I've just said. And so it was quite interesting because he would tell me to shut up, and I'd say, with all due respect, God's above you, Mr. Judge. And I carried on, and he had a bit of a nervous breakdown and left the court several times, and the police came in, and it was a bit of a comedy, really, because they were just dragging us out every 5 minutes, because every time they got us in, it was a bit like the Chicago Seven, it's an English version of that. You know, we we were just like we're all hardened activists. We don't give a fuck
Yeah.
about the niceties of a core of a treasonous regime, right? Just
Well,
like the
that's what's really that's what's really terrific about the work that you do is that you're relentless in demanding this kind of argument be made available to the general public. Despite the fact that there's fewer and fewer venues where you can engage with this kind of logic, um, with sufficient time and sufficient attention to details to 8% to present the imperative of the work that you're doing and also have people there to listen to it. Right. I mean, that's one of the things that moving into the 21st century is it seems that there's fewer and fewer venues where you can have this kind of serious conversation without being called either, a crackpot, an alarmist. all of these things. And so that's why
Mm,
it was really interesting, you attempting to have this kind of conversation in a court situation, in front of people who insist on the preservation of hierarchy, right?
mm,
Which does run completely, as you were saying, runs completely contrary to the work you're trying to do and the arguments you're trying to present.
mm.
Um, so the question is do you have a frustration that y- it's becoming harder and harder to have public discourse leveled effectively against sort of the PR machine that comes out of power brokers in big
Yeah,
business and
yeah, yeah,
government?
yeah. I think what we need to understand is the nature of the scandal, right, as a sociological phenomenon, in the sense that bad people throughout history have done bad things. Okay, everyone knows that. But what's interesting is the process through which bad people get exposed and lose their power, which again happens on a regular basis. And the reason it happens is because of the process of what you might call hubris, right? In other words, bad people get away with it, and then they become more bad because they can get away with it even more. And then they become really bad. And then people start complaining about it, right? And then you
Right.
look at it from the other side of the equation. People start complaining about it. And if it's not that bad, then people can discuss it. But this is where the paradox comes in. As it gets worse, you'd think logically then there'd be more discussion about it. But that's not how scandal works. As it becomes worse, there's less discussion because if you admitted that the badness exists, then the whole system would collapse. You see, it was too bad. So you think about this in a family, right? You know, with your kids, you know, your son's not doing the washing up. It's a bad thing, but it's not that bad, is it? So you go in and say, do the washing up. You use a moral argument, you have a bit of a row, and your son, with a bit of luck, goes, all right, I'm going to do the washing up. And the reason you're challenging them is because it's bad, but it's not that bad. But if it's really bad, you know what happens? No one in the family speaks about it. So, if you're a family and your dad's, abusing your sister or something, you don't go up to your dad and say, hey, you know what, dad? You've got a bit of a problem there, mate.
Yeah,
You don't
right.
talk about it, do you?
No.
And why don't you talk about it? Because it's so bad, you don't talk about it. So what's happening at the moment is it's got so bad that no one talks about it, which obviously is an unstable phase of the progression of a scandal. Because what
Yeah.
it means, of course, is there's another stage to come, and another stage that's come is this tipping point where it actually gets challenged, and then
Yeah.
all hell breaks loose, and then the power collapses.
Yeah.
And the problem of radicals is they think it's linear. They think, oh, they come along and repress you, and then you're stuffed, and then they win. That's not how what's going to happen. You used to be able to talk about it. You just used to get, a month in prison. Now they're totally repressing it. No one wants to talk about it, and that's the calm before the storm, right? Because
Yeah.
at some point, let's say for the sake of argument, between 2030 and 2035, there will be the biggest explosion in human history. Because what we're dealing with objectively is a universal death project which goes on forever. That's what we're unleashing by destroying the biosphere. And we need to be, those of us that can handle the logic of it, need to understand that all hell's going to break loose. And then, then you've got two choices. You go into sort of some ultra fascistic, double downing of decline, or you have, some sort of spiritual democratic revolution. And those are the only two options
Yeah.
that are going to come out of this process. And I'm not saying this, a lot of people think I'm some mad radical. So I'm not saying it as a political person at all. I'm saying it as someone that just knows 101 historical sociology, right? This
Yeah.
happens over and over again. You put the numbers in and you get the numbers out. And if you get you put universal destruction in, then you're going to get revolution out, right?
Yeah.
You see
Yeah.
what I'm saying?
Oh, totally. Yeah.
People, the kids who are 15 now, who are going to be 20, 25 in the 2030s, they're going to be like the 60s generation that discover their mums and dads were Nazis in the 1960s. And if
Right.
you want to see what's going to happen, you should read about that period, particularly in Germany, right? And they were not happy. So it's going to be like that times 100, because
Right.
it's not like your mum and dad were Nazis, and, you know, horrendous and appalling as that was. It's basically your mum and dad basically destroyed the world forever. And they are not going to be happy.
Right. Well, there's even another component to this, which I've heard you talk about before, which you often confound people by saying that you like prison, that you don't mind it, right? And I love how you talk about that because yeah, I think I remember you saying something about how people, everybody has their own agency by being, simply
Yeah.
being, right? That's a consistency, right? And that's perpetual. It doesn't matter whether the door is locked or not, right? So you being in
Yeah.
prison is just you existing and being,
Yeah.
which to me is really interesting because then that begs the next question, which is how aware are people of that fact? Right? Because it seems
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
as you were saying, I think that one of the things that is being constantly demonstrated, and particularly now in the 21st century, with the rise of fascistic thinking and nationalism and so forth, is that there are penalties for giving a shit, and they make them very public, right?
Yeah.
And so they slowly have turned people more and more into spectators rather than
Yeah.
participants. We're
Yeah.
not rehearsed in knowing how to actually participate in giving a shit, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's why the work that you do is really, really important, and the way you talk about it is really, really important because you're a kind person. You're actually a soft-spoken person. You're not
Mm.
a demagogue by any perspective. Right? And so, right. So, I mean, just to demonstrate that it is in many ways, it's just like, how can we find that Zen center, that makes people realize that their lives are worth living, that there's a vulnerability and a beauty and a power in that sort of recognition
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
that age.
Yeah. Well, you know, have me talk for half an hour on this, but like, I mean, I think it's worth saying, like, when I get interviewed, I don't tend to follow the questions because usually when you get interviewed on left wing shows, what people want to do is do this like routine of bashing the bad guys, right? I'm not bothered about the bad guys. Like the bad guys are evil. It's like no, it's not particularly interesting. you know,
No.
the bad
Right, right, right,
guys, bad guys. That has nothing to do with what needs to happen and what needs to be said. Right? There's always evil in the world. Right? That's
right.
my position, and I think it's a right position. Right? You don't get rid of evil. It's like
Yeah,
the issue about evil is whether people are complicit with it. That's what makes evil a problem, right? And there's loads of famous people who've got famous quotes about this, right? Good people do nothing and all the rest of it. What we need to focus on is why people are going along with it, right? And why
mm,
people deluding themselves about it. So the first problem is the repression problem, that people just don't want to accept on the left that it's actually a universal death project, right? People think,
mm,
oh, we're going to vote in, the left and they'll, put in some legislation and we'll sort out the climate issue. There's no climate issue. This is the universal death project, which will last forever, objectively, because it's science, right? So that's the first thing. We're not going to have reform. We're going to have revolution. So we've
right,
discussed that's one thing which you just discussed. The other major problem is people think that bad things are bad, which they never are, right? As a matter of empirical observation, right? If you want to observe human behavior, like good things turn into bad things and bad things turn into good things, or good things have bad aspects and bad things have good aspects. And this is very confusing, but it's only confusing because we're stuck in a modernist, materialistic, reductive, bollocksy system, right, of
right,
understanding reality that came out of the Enlightenment. And that is the perspective which has justified the extractivist destroy the world logic, right, which is on steroids since the Enlightenment. And this is the idea that everything's dead and everyone is dead and everything moves along like billiard balls and all the rest of it. And
right.
this was proven in obviously it had a basis in Newtonian physics and all the rest of it, if you know your sort of philosophy. But
Yeah.
this isn't an abstract thing. This is the heart of the problem of why we're failing, because we're basically using the perspective of the opponent
Hmm.
metaphysically at the deepest level. And
Right.
we don't understand how the world actually works in two respects. In the first respect about physics, like the Newtonian world was destroyed, by Einstein in 1906. So we still have this lag effect that the world is basically, material and there's arrow time, blah, 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 but it's simply objectively incorrect, right? Science has shown that we live in a quantum universe. There's universal consciousness. There's no such thing as death. Da 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 da. Time and space are just an illusion. In other words, like modern physics has confirmed what all the ancient mystics were saying, and indigenous traditions, and most religions up to the 1750s. Right? It's not like I'm talking like crap here. It's like
Yeah.
that was the perspective of most people most of the time in human history. 80% of the human population, even today, is religious. And they're basically saying all this stuff. It's only like the Western secular elite has got this weird idea that Newtonian physics is, an objective situation. And the problem, of course, and this is one of the things I'm most interested in, is how we can turn a sort of quantum consciousness into a revolutionary consciousness. Because at the moment, most people that go on about the quantum thing are just sort of nerdy, you know, clever men in academia, right? But
Right.
what they're saying, as far as I'm concerned, is dynamite. Because what they're really saying is when you go to prison, for instance, prison doesn't exist. See what I mean? Not
Right. Yeah.
not
Yeah.
because I'm being some weird, you know, Taoist philosopher or something. It literally does not exist.
Right.
Jail does not exist, period. What exists is your consciousness, and your consciousness has free will. And you can use that free will to train yourself to see a situation in potentially an infinite series of ways, which doesn't mean it's easy and doesn't mean always. But what it absolutely means is a pluralism of agency, right? Of how you actually see the world. And we all know this, right? It's not like rocket science. Like you start
Yeah.
off, you're 25, the world's hitting you in 20 different things, bad things happen, you feel shit about it, your partner leaves you, you have a nervous breakdown. But by the time you get to 35, 40, you know, you start to change, don't you, as a general rule? And you
Hmm.
realize that you actually have agency. And when something shit happens, you just go, yeah, yeah, fine. you know,
Right. Yeah.
you
So it's
just roll with the punches because
yeah.
you've sussed out that it's not real. What's real
Yeah.
is your choice. And the
Right.
problem is with this sort of juvenile, you know, reductive materialistic leftism is this fetishization of the Newtonian sort of bollocks.
Right.
They put Roger Hallam in jail. How bad is that? No, it's not bad.
Yeah.
It's a situation. It's a
Right.
situation. And this is the paradox of what authentic, revolutionary, rebellious sort of metaphysics is all about, right? And
Yeah.
you can read anyone, right, before the neoliberal period would have told you this, right? The communist that was put in prison in the 1930s went on about it. Camus went on about it, in what was his work, The Rebel. Everyone basically was with the program until we got really like stupid around 1989 and decided, the material thing is all that exists. And what all these guys were saying is is all the rebels in history basically are rebels because they're rebels. You see what I mean? You get
Yeah.
up in the morning and you decide, this is who I am. So if they fuck me over, that's just like occupational hazard.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's just
Yeah.
like, and of course, the problem is because we've got this sort of leftist sort of infantilization of the material, everyone has to pretend that it's shit. And obviously it sometimes is shit, right? If your
Yeah.
partner
Yeah.
leaves you when you're 50, I'm not pretending it's not shit, but you have agency because you've got enough life experience to go, actually, not everyone and not all the time, but substantially a lot of the time, and arguably most of the time, once you've been to prison once or twice, it's just like another day.
Right.
I've been to prison 6, 7 times, by the time they put me into prison, if they if they came into this room, and put me in prison for 20 years, I'd probably be pissed off for about 3 days, and after that, I'd be fine. And
Yeah.
that's not because I'm some sort of weird alien saint sort of thing. It's just because I'm just a regular rebel, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, again, this all has to do with this both an expansion of what um, something like civil disobedience means, and also a expansion of various definitions like violence and discomfort, right? All of those things. Because usually if you say the word, violence to somebody, the first thing they think of, and they relegate it to physical violence, pain and so forth.
Yeah.
And from the work that you do that there's greater violence happening to the planet that is going to affect all of us,
Mm.
and you can mask that kind of violence inside of, the commodification of everything and the corporatization of democracies, if you want to say it that way. Those sorts of reframing of violence, I would say, is one of the biggest problems that we have, because as you were speaking, it's true that it's going to take seismic shifts in what we have going on right now for people to realize, A, that they have the agency that you speak of, and that B, that talk about expanding a definition of something, just expanding the definition of God, right? Because usually when it comes to government and it comes to religion, there's the monarchical structure of that. It's a hierarchy in
Mm.
people's mind. And then they try to
Mm.
figure out where they fit inside that hierarchy. That's the wrong approach, as you've talked about, 100 times. And often when I talk to people about this very aspect of it, I often bring up the what Paul Tillich's strategy on this. The
Yeah.
philosopher theologian that he was. Uh, it made him easier to conduct his arguments by not using the word God and just calling it the ground of being.
Yeah.
Right. So trying to figure out a different language seems to be one of the tactics that you're constantly trying to do, and trying
Yeah.
to keep that language as practical as possible and as grounded in humanitarianism, as opposed to arguments from the right or the left, which I really really appreciate, because that's the center from which we all naturally reside, and it's the place that we have to recognize that we are in before we're going to move as a collective forward in a way that considers not just ourselves, but everybody else.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's nothing unusual about this, right? This is the important thing to realize.
Yeah.
And, part of the challenge is finding a language. Part of the challenge is people learning how to look at reality not through this ideological lens, right? To look at reality empirically, paradoxically, in the sense that, you know, if you look at all the people gone to prison over the last, 2 years, and you gave them a questionnaire, with an anonymous questionnaire, did you enjoy your time in prison? 60% of them are going to say yes. You see what I mean? This is
Right.
not about imposing some weird spiritual ideology upon the objective materiality of the universe, right? The
Right.
materiality doesn't exist, period, right? Quantum physics has shown it, right? Ancient wisdom has shown it, and modern empirical sociology and psychology has shown it. So those guys, listening to it thinking, oh, this is bollocks. Sorry, you're wrong. You've got this
Yeah.
weird religious notion that the material exists. It doesn't. The material, as everyone will tell you who knows about anything, is basically the limit case of reality, right? There are straight lines in the universe, but there's not many of them.
Right.
Most of the universe, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, they're
You,
wiggles. Yeah.
most of the universe is an infinite complex flow of, unfathomable elements, right? That's what the
Yeah.
universe is. The straight
Right.
line is just some invention of some, you know, brainy white guy's mind in 1830, right? This
Right.
is this is a fetish of the Death Project. It's all part of the Death Project, and this
Yeah.
is where it all starts to connect together. Because if you're going to save the world, right, the first thing to understand about saving the world is you're not going to save the world by trying to save the world, right? You're going to save the world by asking a different question, which is how you're going to live your life in this flicker
Right.
of time that you're alive between 0 and 70, right? Which is a
Right.
flicker in the eternity of time. That's a
Yeah.
far more interesting question. It's a bit like, the sort of materialistic, rationalistic question, how to be happy. Everyone knows asking how to be happy is a stupid question, right? I want to be
Mm.
happy. How do I be happy? No, the question is, how am I to live a good life? And
Right.
then as a byproduct of living a good life, you become happy. Everyone knows that, right?
Yeah, yeah.
The sociology,
They know that.
psychology backs it up. The ancient wisdom signs it. Everything's backed up.
Yeah.
So we need to dispense with this colonization of the left by the enemy, right? What the
Yeah.
left needs to do is reconstruct itself around the ecstasy of being, which is, the old language for that is being close to God. And what that means is you understand why you actually live, and the reason you're living is so the universe can get to know itself, right? Or you can paint a picture of what it is to be good. It's above your pay grade to work out whether the world's going to be saved.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah,
That's
you
for
can't do it.
forces
Right. Yeah.
outside your control, right? That's just egotism. What
Right.
what you do, what you so as Ian McGilchrist and people like that, people read his stuff. What he's basically saying is the right brain has to have precedence over the left brain. I mean, this is another analogy. In other words, you have to start with being, like Tillich said. You start with the ground of being. You need to know who you are and why you're here and what it is to be good.
Yeah.
And then, only then, do you go out and work out, how many leaflets you need to leaflet that block.
Right.
So
No, I
instrumentalism
agree.
takes place, but it has to be embedded. The left brain has to be embedded in the right brain, as McGilchrist would say. In other words, you need to know that when the police come and arrest you, it's another day, because it is another day, right? Which just
Right.
doesn't mean to say that you're not thinking, how you want to get the maximum number of people at a demo.
Right.
This is subtle. It's a subtle sort of balance between instrumentalism and virtue, because you do need both, right? You can't just be wandering around going, "Oh, I'm so virtuous, Gwen. I'm
Yeah.
loving everyone." No, the shit's happening out there, and you need to be dealing with it. And this
Yeah.
is,
You also you don't and you also shouldn't be taking it personally. Right. I mean, that's one of the things
well, the point is,
too.
there's no person.
Exactly.
That's the
Right. So
point,
I mean,
right?
that's
So
yeah.
this is
I mean,
how we can continually sort of get ourselves drawn back into materialism, is by using the language of materialism. Oh,
yeah.
myself is being damaged. There's no self. There is
Right.
literally no self. All
Yeah. Yeah.
there
Yeah.
is this moment, right, between me and you
Yeah.
talking now and the people listening. That's all there is, guys. Everything else
Yeah.
is a hypothesis at best. So
100%. Yeah.
so what does this practically mean? Because everyone talks about this stuff, what it practically means is people need to go through a process of self-purification, otherwise transcendence of the self. And this is what everyone misses out of the so-called non-violence project, right? It's not to do with non-violence. That's the output. The input is preparation, which is the training, going through the training, whether it's meditation, role-playing, witnesses, testimonies. There's 2,000 years of history of how people get themselves into a position where they are detached from the consequences of oppression, right? Like I read this book when I was in prison about the early Christians who are classics of this, right? As everyone knows, they're all pottering around, and every now and again the Romans would go and, crucify them all. And, there was a bunch of guys and they got crucified near Lyon in 2000 AD or something. And a few of them ran away. And the guys
Right.
getting crucified were going, I mean, I'm sure this isn't the exact translation, but they said something along the lines of, you know what? Those guys didn't train properly. The guys that ran away didn't train properly. In other words, this is not about being a saint, right? It's about training programs. And this is what people forget. And this is why civil resistance is fucked, because it just thinks you adopt non-violence as a tactic. You see what I mean? They think,
Yeah.
we're all gathered, in the center of New York, and now we're going to be nonviolent, guys, because that'll mean we'll win. It's like, and then it turns out it's not that sexy, and then you go, let's try violence instead, as if you're buying apples and oranges in the supermarket. It's so fucking superficial, and that's why it doesn't work. Everyone and their dog knows that if you're going to be successful at civil resistance, if you look at the literature, then obviously it has to have a religious basis. Right, which doesn't mean you have to be a Catholic,
No. Yeah.
just in case you're panicking, right? But it sort of helps, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
you need to have a cultural mechanism of transcendence,
Yeah.
And this is, I read a lot of literature 20 years ago, and I read a load of literature while I was in prison. And, the funny thing about the sociologist is to go, oh, solidarity was successful because of the Christians, the Catholics supporting it. But no one gives a metaphysical, like, rationale for why the religious people are more sustainable as a matter of sociological fact, right?
Right.
Everyone knows that religious people stay out longer. You know what I mean? They can get beaten up and they're more forgiving. Why is that? It's not just because they've got funny genes that makes them religious, right? Religion isn't a black box. You can look inside the black box. And if you look inside the black box, what do you find? What you find is 2,000 years of wisdom about what it is to be, right?
Right.
Combined with life experience. And the
Right.
fusion of those two things mean, okay, I'm going out, onto the streets today, and if I do, then so be it. And everyone thinks, oh my God, that's so difficult. No, it's not. Like, most people for most of history are okay about dying. They just are, which isn't to say they want to die, right? But
Right.
if they are needed to die for transcendent reasons, they will go and die, for better or worse, right? And obviously this has got its dark side around, the fascistic attraction to death, and, the traditional hierarchy and all the patriarchal bollocks and all the rest of it. But
Yeah.
it's also, a fact that for most of human history, you know, people are not actually that bothered about the maintenance of their physical self. Period. Sorry.
Right.
No, it's just an American exceptionalism. No disrespect.
Yeah. None taken.
I had to get a little
From
pointy
across
for
the
those
pond. Yeah.
Americans,
That's that. That's
with
nice.
that weird ideology.
I'm in league with you, my friend. Um, yeah, so it's all really. Again, I just so appreciate your take on this, and suggesting, you name all the right people, Camus, and just this need to sort of surrender to the flow, right, and sort of face to a great degree, face the universe with a universal shrug,
Yeah,
right? And yeah, so all of that said, I mean, as you said earlier, I mean, this is a conversation that we could just extend in so many different ways and talk about how art and poetry and music, all of those things contribute to a meaningful life that is based on not a trajectory or a goal, but just sort of the jazz and the joy of doing it. you know we
yeah,
don't dance to get to a particular spot on the floor, right? And that's a way to live a life. All of that said, take a moment to talk about your new project, the 4 Billion Dead Project, and how you want people to uh, get involved with this movement, because a lot of our conversation has to do with the need for a democratic revolution, right? Now, a lot of that, from what you're talking about, and I totally agree, is something that is going to come from our physiological need and our impulse to want to save ourselves. It's not going to be a matter of just like, uh, you know, I need to justify my survival based on some sort of like a fiscal responsibility to my family or something like that,
yeah,
right? It all comes from like this impulse that is just like driven from our hearts. Uh,
yeah,
so as you said, I do agree with you that we have an opportunity with the younger generation, who is looking at the monstrous state of the world and just wanting to do what happened in the 1960s and early 70s, which is just like, fuck mom and dad. This is an opportunity for us to actually take control of our own destinies and do something outside
mm,
of the normal strategies on how to fix things. And again, not allowing power to draw all of the parameters of the discussion. That's one of the key things, and making this not a political discussion, but at best a cultural discussion and just a humanitarian discussion. Right, all of that.
yeah,
Okay. No, the
yeah,
question is talk for a second about the 4 Billion Dead Project, and
yeah.
also what that means.
Well, to continue the sort of logic of what I'm saying, I suppose, I think it's important. A lot of what I've said, in the answer to your previous question, people see this through what you might call an individualist spiritual frame. So people are familiar with the notion of detachment and enlightenment and meditation and all this stuff. But what's happened in Western society is a tragic distortion of what it actually is, because it's not about the individual self. It's not about the progression of the individual self. Again, no disrespect to, American culture and all the rest of it, but individualism is not what it's about, right? As an,
Hmm.
as his historical observation. What this is about and what the challenge is to move beyond the individualization of the logic of it. This is not about, Dwayne, you're doing exercise A, B, and C, and then you're cool and you can go and sit in the road. What it's about is the proactive design of enculturement processes that enable collectives of people to engage in civil resistance to the point of death, right? That's the project. And that's totally doable, right? Because there's 101 historical examples and it needs to be systematized. It can't be casual. It can't be, a bunch of people just got together in a coffee shop and they just all happen to be individually on the point of transcending or something, right? That's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is, we might even call the industrialization of a spiritualization. Do you see what I mean? So how does this work? How it works is not by looking at the endpoint. This is not about building a movement. It's about building spaces where people come together and engage in things beyond the rational self.
Right.
As you said, whether this is humor or art or music or ritual or things that basically take the ego out of the equation. And then
Right.
you find yourself. This is how it works, right? You find yourself with the courage. This is not some, Protestant, will thing, right? You will be better, as my mum would say, Calvinist, you go into a room and force yourself to be a better person. That just doesn't work, guys. Unless you're
Well,
just really weird, 1 in 1,000 people can do that stuff. Most of us, we're all social beings, right? We basically, we'll go and shoot Jews or we'll be saints, depending upon what everyone else is doing. That's how the human psyche works. So the 4 billion dead thing is really it sounds pretty obvious in the sense that, the reason why it's called 4 billion dead is because the British insurance industry did a report on putting carbon into the atmosphere. Notice I don't use the word climate. Right, there's a process here, guys. It's not a noun. Putting carbon into the atmosphere to the point of going over to 2 degrees, will kill 2 billion people and 4 billion at 3 degrees. And in a spasm of English repression, they put this information in the appendix.
of course.
And just as a little aside, when The Guardian did an article about it, just in case you have any remaining respect for The Guardian, the headline was, there's a strong possibility we're going to lose 50% of GDP by later in the century. Where's that effect? And then you had to read to paragraph 5 because it slipped in. There's also going to be 4 billion deaths.
Right.
Okay. So if
Yeah.
you don't think the liberal space has been totally saturated with capitalistic logics, then read The Guardian, right?
Yeah.
This is, so the point about this is there's no words, as I'm going to say on Saturday, right? So the 4 billion dead project is not about talking about 4 billion dead, because the very act of talking about it is an obscenity.
Right.
In a certain way that how we look about, the Holocaust, it's a similar sort of sense, isn't it? There's something sickening about the materialization of it, because what it is a spiritual crime. It's a catastrophe of the spirit that this is happening. And so the idea of 4 billion dead is about ritual. And the ritual is that people are going to take a sign and take a picture of themselves holding up a sign saying 4 billion dead. And then there's going to be no discussion. There's no, and what we need is a new act by the government to sort out, because as soon as you say that, then basically you're violating the eternity of the evil of it, right? You're pretending, you're moving it back into the liberal bollocks. that it is
Right.
worse. So the idea is then more people do it. And then the idea I've got is you have a march and everyone's like, like the civil rights guys used to do, they were organized. They weren't just out rambling along. These marches where I had, I am a man. I love those. It's
Yeah.
some black guy and it's like, I am a man. I mean, it's not exactly slightly politically incorrect, as you might say. But leaving that aside, I just love, they were in their suits and they were holding the sign and it was a proper sign and they were
Right.
5 meters away from each other. Gandhi used to do the same thing. This was a
Yeah.
military formation routine. So that's the vision we've got of it. This is not Western individualist sort of let's go on a demo because we've got an identity around 4 billion dead. That's obscene. What we want to do is something that's silent and organized and military-esque, as you might say, right? And
Right.
so you've got 100 people and they're walking through a Western city with signs saying 4 billion dead, and everyone's handing out a piece of paper with the photocopy of Appendix A of the British, you know, insurance industry, which, as an aside, presumably they know something about maths, right? If anyone knows anything about maths, it's the insurance industry, isn't it,
Yeah.
guys?
Yeah.
you know, all
Yeah.
Americans know that. Insurance, it's about the fucking numbers, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So the numbers are 4 billion, right? Uh, and yeah, there's nothing to be said. And the purpose of this, the intuition of this, you're basically creating a collective psyche, which
Yeah.
which transcends the self. You're
Right.
training people. The ritual is actually a training, and
Yeah.
the purpose of the training is to get people out of their individualistic, rationalistic self. So when the
Yeah.
rupture comes, these people are capable of being human rather than herd animals, right?
Right.
In the best sense of human. They're able to transcend the material, which is what the ecstasy of being the human is about, right? Is
Yeah.
about being able not to be a lump of stuff. And that
Right.
means that you will go into the line of fire, like they did in the Salt March, and you'll be victorious as a side product of your ability to transcend the self. And I can't go into the details about how the civil disputes works, not least because they'll put me in prison for 2 years, right? Because they'll watch this video. But, if you're interested in how this process works, then, look at the monks in Burma, in the 1960s and 70s, look at what happened in the Philippines. There's 10 or 12 classic civil resistance episodes over the last 100 years. And if you look at them with your eyes open, i.e. not through a materialistic sociological frame, if you look at it where you're actually looking at how people actually saw themselves, right, as
Yeah.
opposed to how sociologists thought of them, then you will realize that the interiority of the psyche of resistance is the ecstasy of being in the face in the face of repression, and that's why repression doesn't work.
Right.
This is the fundamental metaphysical reason why repression doesn't work. Because what repression does is reinforces the transcendence of the self. Because it's training. You see what I mean? It's like that's how the transcendent psyche looks upon bad stuff. If you put me in prison, it's a bit like going into the gym and lifting up 200 kilos or whatever. It's like, oh, great, I've got a chance to lift another 200 kilos. Oh, great. I'm moving along the line to being close to God. Obviously, I'm never
Right.
going to get there.
Yeah.
But it's a different logic. People in our society like to get rich, but historically, people like to get close to God. How do they do that? Through the
Right.
imposition of suffering, right? And,
Yeah.
and that, as I said, has its dark sides. But fundamentally, this is how it's going to work. And this also sounds bollocks, okay, as you know, right? Probably half the people listening to this thinking it's bollocks. But the fact of the matter is, in the 2030s, this is all going to come striding back, right? In the same way as there's a little analogy of this, from American history. In the 50s, you had all the beat poets, right? But only 20 people gave a shit about the beat poets. You know this, right? When whatever it was, On the Road was written, it wasn't like he had a fan club. Everyone thought he was a dick. And in 1962, the post-war generation decided reductive nuclear madness materialism was probably not that cool. What their parents was doing was just stupid. And then they got into spiritual stuff, and then suddenly they're cultural heroes, and 10 million people reading, on the road or whatever, right? I mean,
Yeah.
when did we've all read it, right? Read it when I was
Yeah. Yeah.
21. It's not actually
Yeah.
that good, is it? But it's okay. But you see how that's the same thing is going to happen. At the moment, we're in 1956. We're with Elvis. You see what I mean? We're
Yeah. Yeah.
pretending it's rock and roll.
Yeah.
We haven't hit psychedelics, but we will in about 2034. But they
I've
won't
argued
be
that.
individualist. They won't. This time round, it won't be individualism, right?
Right.
This time round, it's going to be collectivism. It's going to be variations on Catholicism. you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
People will not have the choice to be individualist in 2034 in the same way they did in 1972. So
Right.
this is what's going to happen as day follows night. That's
I.
my
This is a
prophecy.
beautiful way to end our conversation. We're going to learn how to get out of our own way, and once you do that, you start to invite participation from the universe and from everybody else around you. So I think that that's a really a beautiful prediction, and I hope we're not murdered before it comes true.
Yeah, well, death is not the end. Remember, Wayne. Dwayne.
Right.
It's all right. Don't panic.
Uh,
Famous
I'm
last word. You'll probably walk out of this interview and being up tonight, and I'll have a nervous breakdown tomorrow, and you'll be going, "Guy, that guy was talking bollocks." You know what I mean? It was just bottling on. I mean,
yeah.
don't get me wrong. I am pretty normal. Shit happens. I do get quite upset. Well, I'm not saying what I'm pointing to. You know, all I'm pointing to is being close to God is not being God. You see what I mean? You're never going to be God. You're never going to be, a saint. This is nothing to do with that. It's about progressing. It's the continual progress towards, not being a slave to material conditions. And it's lifelong process, as we all know. So that's what I'm talking about. I'm not.
Well, there's also the need to recognize the fact that maybe a way to consider God is that that God would not be a saint.
Yeah,
I
yeah. Well,
mean,
there's all this. Yeah,
yeah,
there's lots of
yeah.
going
In other
round
words,
in
we are.
circles
I mean,
then about it, right?
yeah, yeah. I mean, isn't that
Yeah,
why they killed Jesus? I mean, he didn't say that I am. He said, "I am a son of God, not the son of God." That was altered. That one word was altered. So that realization of the fact that we are all God, if we want to talk in those terms and use that word, has a beautiful ring of musicality to it. I don't even want to qualify it as being like
yeah,
being good or bad, but it is the recognition that we are all connected, and that the meaning of life has to do with just the experience in and of itself. You don't have
yeah,
to quantify it with other things and then build a concept around that and then honor the concept and then ignore what the concept was originally based on. That's the whole bullshit aspect of it. So I hear so much of what you're saying is about removing all of the architecture that is surrounding something that is unnameable and
yeah.
recognizing it and being wordless, it's speechless in the presence of that is what the meaning of life is. And
Yeah, yeah,
that
yeah. And like we don't need to, and we never will have a full understanding, right? This is one of the big problems. People go, "Well, Roger, what about this? And what about this?" My response is, fuck that. Just go on the training weekend, right? Get out
yeah.
of your head, right? This
Yeah,
is
yeah.
this is my last word because we've got to finish the interview. Go on the training weekend, right? It's not about you deciding. It's about you putting yourself in a position where, through social interaction, you will find yourself deciding. Right. This is the click point. Right. This is not about you and your little, bourgeois head of individualism. Right. It's no, no, no. Go on the training weekend, relax. It'll be all right. And this is what we need, right? All around the Western world. We don't need lots of little intellectual masturbation sessions, right? What we
Right.
need is training weekends where you go and you do A, B, and C and D, and you find yourself in some sort of community of resistance. And then you do it again, and then you do it again. And, the process never ends. But at a certain point, you become competent enough to, you know, create the world that's coming after capitalism.
Amen. Let's make that culture happen. Yeah. So thanks so much for this conversation. I'm going to make sure that everybody sees it, and I will put all the relevant links and so forth to this new project and how we're going to be moving forward. So really, thanks again, Roger.
Yeah,
Really,
yeah.
really.
Well, thanks so much for having me, and best of luck, everyone. Thank you. See you in
Always.
a